Was the Quran produced by man? If not, what makes it different? It's important to note that the questions we'll be posing are complementary, and each will serve to elucidate the next. That is to say, fulfilling one also fulfills the rest. By contrast, failing to fulfill any one of them is final. The answer to the first and ultimate question will depend on how these questions are answered. Is the Quran a complete text? Is it subject to additions, omissions, or revisions? Are there errors in the Quran? Are there contingencies or accidents? Syntactic compositions or formulations that serve apparently no purpose? Is the Quran subject to reinterpretation, depending on the time and place? Verse 80 of Surah An-Nahl responds to our first question, namely, is the Quran a complete text? And based on the clear generality of the verse, and that it includes a totalizing expression, لِكُلِّ شَيْءٍ, we should be able to infer that within the book lay answers to all fundamental questions, particularly atemporal and immutable ones. That is, questions that have been asked, questions that are being asked, as well as questions that will be asked. We shall also be able to infer that the author, to even be eligible to make such a statement, must hold a relationship of omniscience over the species to whom he assigned the book. Are there contingencies or grammatical errors or accidents in the Quran? The answer comes in verse 82 of Surah An-Nisa. We find in that verse, clear and implicit, an answer not only to our question, but to the implications and connotations of our question. Not only is it setting itself apart from any human work, which it informs us would be and is always laden with errors, but it also invites us to investigate that claim. The proof, it tells us, is in the pudding. What's also being suggested by the verse is that it's devoid of such predicaments as contingencies or accidents generally found in literature, not only on the linguistic structural level, i.e. the syntax, but also semantically, with the more subtle dichronic and synchronic aspects familiar to philologists and historians of ideas. The Quran is said to be eloquent, in fact, more eloquent than any human work. But since the word eloquent these days more often signifies an aesthetic quality or property, we're better off using a more specific or pragmatic term with an emphasis on utility, like felicitous, to do away with the subtle vanity and the somewhat human feel implied by the term eloquent. We must also note that felicity is a matter of degree, and which involves the problem of synonymy, which we'll be discussing shortly. Some words, based on either speech habit, i.e. tradition, or etymology, i.e. the study of roots, can be said to be more felicitous than others, more appropriate to the context. As a consequence, we should be able to draw the conclusion that the Quran's use of vocabulary is not only felicitous, but of the highest felicity, superlative, to the extent that no word, taken in its context, could have been replaced or substituted by another. As any substitution, something translators unknowingly perpetrate, would immediately trigger a kind of dominoes effect, whereby the result is not only the meaning of the verse being altered, but potentially the context, the whole surah, and thereby the Quran itself. That is, if we take it to be a complete text, or a painting of an overall picture. In this sense, we can compare the Quran to a puzzle, or a Rubik's Cube, or better yet, a mathematically and geometrically precise structure that could not stand lest every block is positioned perfectly. Which brings us to the first tenet. For a structure to be considered as perfect, it must be so with the view that it's complete and its purpose known. Typically, in human languages, we use lots of synonyms, and a synonym is a word or phrase that has the same or nearly the same meaning as another word or phrase in the same language. It should be known that synonyms are a sign of poverty. We replace the right word with the almost right word, or a metaphor. When for any reason, such as poverty of language, no symbols at hand, we can choose a symbol whose referent is analogous to our referent and transfer the symbol. This can be convenient, but only where precision is either not needed, or the words used synonymously have lost their individual meaning, period. but where precision is crucial, such as in a highly technical document, or any text in which the likelihood or margin of misunderstanding should be as narrow as possible, like a constitutional, legal, medical, or operational document, then failure to see that such symbols, i.e. synonyms, are metaphorical or approximative only, i.e. are taken literally, falsity arises. As Mark Twain wrote, "The difference between the right word and the almost right word is a really large matter. It is the difference between a lightning and a lightning bug." As far as normal day-to-day life speech, synonyms are largely harmless. But insofar as the Quran is concerned, Twain is frighteningly, or rather, strikingly accurate. Although synonyms are convenient, it will be found that, etymologically speaking, no two words used synonymously signify the exact thing. And this is a major dilemma. In fact, the biggest, as far as the business of translation in general, and the translation of the Quran in particular. We take a word like "anas" in the Quran to be equivalent to the English word mankind, or the French word humanité, and translate it as such on so basis, but a closer study of the word "anas" as used within the confines of the Quran will reveal it to be very different, in fact disproportionately so, compared to mankind, and the subsequent translation into which will stave off the underlying essential connotations of the Quranic word "anas" to such an extent as to leave it barren and, if you will, un-Quranic. This, mind you, happens with most, if not all, words. That being said, the Quran must be etymologically consistent, and we hereby use the term etymologically to mean fixed, as in, any given word possesses and reserves an essential meaning, regardless of context, tense, inflections, agglutinates, prefixes, or suffixes familiar to English. Such grammatical tools don't change the meaning of the word to which they're applied, but only make it more dynamic. A word like "anas," for example, should connote and signify the same thing as its inflections. For example, "anastu, nasiya," al-ins, and so forth. The, so to speak, core essence or spirit of the word is one and should always be constant and unchanging, to the effect that there's something so intrinsic to it, or any Quranic term for that matter, that makes it irreplaceable, and by extension, indispensable to the context in which we find it. Take the following example from verse 10 of Surah Taha. There is a reason, or if you will, semantic function that makes Moses in this scenario apply the word anastu instead of ra'aytu, for example, or any other word, and the fact that almost all translations took this subtlety for granted reveals a great and honestly fatal lack of comprehension and sophistication on the part of the translators. Inflections in the Quran are central, recurring linguistic devices, and it's crucial to always take into account the fact that inflection is the same meaning reproduced according to the tense or demands of a given context. Humboldt thought that different tongues provide very different intensities of response to life. Different languages penetrate at varying depths. Schlegel identifies higher and lower grammars, and both ultimately conclude that inflection is one of those superior features of language. It allows and/or compels a far greater, more dynamic treatment of action. It makes qualitative perception more acute and conduces necessarily to a more developed articulation, i.e., realization of abstract relations. No placement, composition, or configuration of words must be found to be accidental or based on a purely aesthetic sense, i.e. vanity, as that would reveal it to be a human work, because vanity is human. Word placement and syntax here is determined by grammatical exigency, not convenience. As said, there is a specific utility that characterizes the vocabulary of the Quran, a total pragmatism that makes every word a sort of key. French writer Léon Bloy wrote that history is an immense liturgical text where the iotas and the dots are worth no less than the verses or chapters, but the importance of one or the other is indeterminate and profoundly hidden. The analogy of history with philology here is no accident or a passing metaphor. but in fact a clear example of the issue raised in Part 1. Bloy here demonstrates in the span of 2 lines what we discussed in Part 1, how exact meaning and significance, when placed in the flux of history, becomes indeterminable and lost, because there's no telling what something decisively means or symbolizes in the grand scheme of things, because history is a shorthand we use to refer to the infinite and continual interplay of events. Understanding history, or any historical event, after all, insomuch as understanding a sentence, involves a context, the process of subsuming a particular under a universal. By understanding something, we've effectively understood it in relation to a whole host of other ideas. The problem with applying that principle to history is that history is happening. There is no actual whole to speak of. Hence why German historian Droysen thought that the task of the historian is endless, for history, which he calls the moral world, is in restless development, because the constant unfolding of events puts our understanding of it in flux. The so-called bigger picture, or as Schlegel puts it, higher completeness, cannot be grasped by us, because we're simply not omniscient, as every moment forms an endless maze of affairs, circumstances, interests, and conflicts. And who besides God knows and grasps that unfathomable totality, and who, by extension, is more qualified to give an account of it? And this is the whole idea behind revelation, to give man an account of that which he can never hope to grasp by himself. The significance of Leon Bloy's statement goes far beyond that analogy, in that it ushers forth the question, what if such a liturgical text can exist, physically, a text that, unlike that analogous dark book of history as scholar Hans Gadamer dubbed it, is within reach? The idea of an eternal book, or the book of books, is not exactly alien. Borges duly notes this, elaborating that Leon Bloy simply applied to the problem of history what the Jewish Kabbalists thought about Scripture. The Kabbalist approaches this idea through the belief that Scripture, a work whose author is God, cannot possibly be anything less than an absolute text, a text in which the collaboration of chance is nil. However, this kind of obsession over the structure and syntax, or, if you will, the edifice of the text, at the expense of what's contained within, exposes a human element of vanity. And that's precisely where the Kabbalists fail. Not to mention that they compromised, disfigured, and appropriated their scripture in the pursuit of magic, inventing new word combinations using the 22 letters of the Hebrew alphabet and elaborating methods by which to do so. The rigorous and flawless character of the Quranic syntax should, if anything, only serve to assure us that the author's words couldn't have been said any other way, and that we don't need to assume that what the author is saying is exactly what he had in mind, but trust that that's the case, and trust that the words are in fact on the page. But realistically, to what extent can the author be trusted? What's the author's original intent? The central question posed by the problem of intentionalism. Schleiermacher recognizes the problem of intentionalism that pervades historical texts, as well as the problem of time and the continuous motion of history. And his solution to it was to the effect of understanding the writer better than he understood himself, an approach that involves engaging the unconscious dimension of the author's work by going behind his words, so to speak. The same way a psychologist might use the words of his patient as mere data to help access his unconscious. This brings us to the question which boggled philologists and historians for the longest. In what sense can we as readers understand a given text? In terms of what the author appears to be saying, or in terms of what we feel he ought to have said, or is trying to say, but couldn't, either due to a grammatical mistake, a mistranslation, or the perceived philosophical or scientific inferiority of what's considered the author's era? Is perfect syntax, and we use perfect loosely, the antidote to the problem of intentionalism? Or, to put it more simply, what does it take for us readers to understand the writer's words exactly how the writer intended them to be understood? Is there a way for the writer to make it so that his words could never be misinterpreted or reinterpreted? Is this a problem? If so, is it something the Quran solves or also suffers from? It's not a secret that reading is an act of interpretation. In reading a historical document, in collating the modes of narrative in previous written history, in interpreting speech acts performed in the distant or near past, which are part and parcel of the reading experience, the reader, writes Hexter, finds himself becoming more and more the translator in the technical sense. And in attempting to understand a text, the reader, unconsciously, embodies the etymological spirit of the word read, meaning to counsel, advise, arrange, which, quite curiously, what truly ends up happening. The reader, who's now a translator, invades, extracts, and brings home. Our case becomes much more challenging when we consider the well-known truth that even reading a text out of the past of one's own language and literature is a manifold act of interpretation, as demonstrated by the fact that we require glossaries, lexical dictionaries, and thesauruses just to read and appreciate novels and texts belonging to an earlier phase of history, and that is just to deal with a temporal morphological problem within the same language. And for a live example of this, we shall look no further than Shakespeare, about whose work George Stiener said the following: "A true Shakespeare library is, of itself, very nearly a summation of human enterprise. It would include manuals of falconry and navigation, of law and of medicine, of venery and of the occult. There is scarcely a Shakespearean play which does not use the extensive glossary of Elizabethan musical terms to make vital statements about human motives or conduct." Shakespeare here is simply one example of a universal problem. The writer here is no more a prisoner of his time than his non-contemporary reader, and this is no fault on either party, because it is in the nature of language that words undergo a great variety of changes under a wide range of circumstances with the passage of time. Words come to point to things they did not formerly designate, or cease to point to things they did designate. Some go extinct, and some drop out of use and become unintelligible, or nearly so. How does the author, who is no more than the product of his time, struggle and successfully surmount that powerful and insurmountable current of change which threatens to sweep him and his words over? How is knowledge possible if any understanding, even of a few great writers, is impossible without some acquaintance with the general background of their age? Professor Palmer answers that surmounting that powerful current requires writers of commanding genius, who can tell of past, future, and as well as of the years in which they live. But still, are humans capable of attaining the level of genius necessary to write an eternal book? Since we referenced the etymology of the word read, we shall now compare it to the quasi-equivalent word used in the Quran. And it will be found very intriguing that there is no such word as read in the English or Indo-European sense in the Quran. We find only the words iqra, from which is derived the name al-Quran, or Quran, also tilawa, which is the main term used to express the act of reading or reciting the Quran. Contrary to the popular belief, iqra does not mean read or recite even, and we know this by examining the morphology of the word iqra in different Quranic contexts. And we're here applying the hermeneutics principle to understand the part from the whole, the same way a sentence is understood grammatically. We find here that the word occurs in more than one setting: a cosmological setting, qararan, designating or describing the earth's position, not only with respect to the species and creatures crawling upon and indwelling the earth, but also with respect to the heavens, the samawat, and the Quranic image of the universe. We also find istaqar, describing how an object settles or reposes after a period of flux, change, or movement. We also find qurri'ayna, describing the contrary state of fear and insecurity which Mary was experiencing before God eventually bestowed upon her the peace and quiet that He'd promised her, therefore describing the opposite state of disappointment. From these various morphological uses of the word, we discern that the word iqra, falsely equated with read, has a greater and even deeper radius of significance than previously thought. And from it we also understand the underlying meaning of the word al-Quran, and why it was named that. As Dr. Munsterberg perfectly put it, the world becomes a world by its identical recurrence. This identity means fulfillment, means satisfaction, means value. And whatever changes must still present an identity in its changes, for that's where its identity is expressed, and it does this by showing that the change belongs to its own meaning. The other word used in the Quran is tilawa, the same word used to describe how the moon apparently follows or tails the sun, and notably never catching up to it. And we also get this from studying the morphology of the word tilawa as used exclusively in the Quran. If anything, this offers us an extraordinary example of the differences between reading in the Indo-European sense as editorial and interventionist, in that it involves on the reader's part the unconscious acts of rearrangement and or reformulation, more patently demonstrated by the translator, and reading in the Quranic sense as non-editorial, but rather a relation of constant pursuit and guidance, because, as evidenced by the morphological method, we're pursuing the essence of the word in various contextual territories, and we here see not only the difference between iqra and tilawa, but also the relationship between them. The reader pursues it into settlement, or refuge, so to speak, a final resting place, sheltered from uncertainty and change. Quranic vocabulary moves fluidly across the rigid lines and barriers placed between different disciplines of knowledge, from cosmology all the way to personal affairs. Words carry that erudite consistency, or felicity. By being acquainted with the Quranic glossary and its use of language, the reader not only grasps the meaning of the word in their individual contexts, but discovers an inherent and distinct characteristic of the universe in which he lives. There is an inward affinity, or akinness as Benjamin Lee Whorf put it, between language and nature, which was, for ages, well known to the various high cultures whose historical continuity on Earth has been enormously longer than that of the Western European culture. And we here recall Heidegger's statement that language is the house of being, which in the Quran receives its full expression. Is the Quran subject to reinterpretation? Can it be understood or reinterpreted in the light of new discoveries in science? The short answer is no. The Quran is not something which can mean different things to different people in different times, as that would subject it to the problem of change from which we've been trying to escape. If the author is omniscient, his book must transcend that change. It must present a fixed solution in a Heraclitean world of change. It must be transcendental, congenial to and contemporaneous with its reader. And unlike human literature, it must be its own glossary or dictionary. Plus, the author of the Quran himself professes these works' immutability, as well as immunity from change, and it's clear here that it's addressing those fundamental and perennial scruples and problems presented by human literature. And what's the word hafidhun here designating, if not integrity and constancy and oneness? And what's integrity and oneness if the text is this malleable and expedient substance that one can, accordingly so, reinterpret? If no semantic form is timeless, as Professor Stiener says, a work dictated by God himself must be the opposite. It's argued, however, that the Quran was only syntactically preserved, in that the words and the, as it were, punctuations have remained the same since its revelation. And whereas it must be true if the author were God, it does not follow that the content and the vehicle of that content are not related or don't share the same destination, as every syntactic preservation is necessarily a semantic one. And the syntax is simply the rules and laws which make the meaning possible, otherwise the whole project is pointless. As far as the common attitude towards the Quran, the words are on the page, but the meaning is elsewhere, namely the traditional texts of the exegetes, or the books and research papers of contemporary scientists. There is a wide chasm between the words and their meaning here, and it's due to this very chasm that arose the hundreds of interpretations and the dozens of schools and sects, each claiming their version to be the true one and the rest total heresies. Yet if we take the verse to mean clearly and explicitly both, that is, a syntactic as well as semantic preservation, then the advent of different, conflicting schools of thought and interpretations could only result from the incorrect treatment of the text. That is to say, the philosophical division experienced in the Muslim world is a conflict over the method, caused by the interpolation or intrusion of alien sources into the book. If the Quran is indeed preserved, and the syntactic evidence for which is sound, it does not follow that there should be hundreds of different interpretations, provided that no outside influence or source is sandwiched between the Quranic text and that which it conveys. And this is emboldened by the fact that the Quran is clearly referred to by the singular al-Kitab, which appears, and is signified by the definite article, an atemporal statement affirming the oneness, unity, and most notably, timelessness of the text, and at the same time against any form of pluralism, potential or foregoing. One of the implications, in fact the main, of the word al-Kitab is that it must be in a sense aboriginal in nature, primeval so to speak, and this complements the nature of the Arabic language and the Semitic language family in general, where, as J. Pedersen wrote, the primitive character of the language is preserved and where the language naturally gives an immediate expression of the process of thought. Al-Kitab is, in a nutshell, the expression of the immutable nature of the Quran. It's not a synonym for the word Quran, since as we saw the Quran expresses a different characteristic. Al-Kitab here is identity, a summation of the identical character of each of the Quran's words, and it's thereby here where the aforementioned features of felicity, superlativeness, and immutability are housed. In conclusion, the purpose of the video is to show that answering the question of whether or not the Quran is man-made is not simple. It's extremely demanding and requires familiarity with the problems of understanding, meaning, history, time, and language that shroud literature. It's through acquaintance with the shortcomings of the human mind and learning to identify them that the aforementioned question finds an answer.